The billionaire was a man everyone knew about. His name was whispered in offices, in restaurants, even in quiet homes, and yet no one ever spoke of him with a smile. People lowered their voices when they mentioned him, as if afraid that somehow he would hear and punish them. He was rich, so rich that his money reached into every corner of the city. He owned buildings that touched the sky, companies that decided who worked and who didn't, and even some politicians who were supposed to serve the people seemed to serve him instead. His shadow stretched everywhere, and people learned to live inside that shadow, careful not to step out of line. From the very beginning he was known for his temper. It was not just an ordinary kind of anger, it was the kind that could break careers in a second, the kind that could send a family into fear overnight. If a worker upset him, that worker would be gone by morning. If a manager displeased him, the whole department could be shut down. People said he never forgave and he never forgot. He carried grudges like others carried wallets, close to the heart, ready to pull out whenever he felt like punishing someone, and so people walked on eggshells around him, speaking softly, nodding quickly, and never daring to say no. He moved through the city like a storm, expensive cars clearing the road ahead of him, assistants running to open his doors, and bodyguards making sure no one came too close. Wherever he went the air changed, laughter died down, conversation stopped, waiters trembled when they served him in fine restaurants, CEOs sweated when they sat across from him in meetings, even judges, people who were supposed to stand above fear, seemed nervous when he appeared in court. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of his anger because everyone had heard the stories. There was the story of a small business owner who had once refused to sell her land to him. Within months her shop was gone, crushed under taxes and inspections until she had no choice but to close. There was the story of a journalist who had written a bold article about his shady deals. The journalist was fired soon after, and no newspaper in the city would hire him again. There were so many stories like this that people stopped telling them, because telling them was dangerous too. The billionaire always seemed to find out who was talking, and silence was safer than courage. And yet, despite all this fear, many people admired his wealth. They looked at his shining cars, his giant houses, his expensive suits, and they thought he was untouchable. They thought he was proof that money could buy anything, even respect. But in truth it was not respect he received. It was fear dressed up to look like respect. People clapped when he entered a room, but in their hearts they prayed he would not notice them. People praised him to his face, but behind his back they whispered about his cruelty. It was a strange kind of power, one that ruled not through love, not through admiration, but through the cold grip of fear. The city itself seemed shaped by him. His buildings blocked the sunlight from smaller shops. His billboards showed his companies everywhere. His name was on schools, hospitals, theaters, yet the ordinary people who lived under his empire often struggled to pay rent or buy food. He was a giant and they were ants, that was how many saw it, and the giant never cared if he stepped on someone while he moved forward. His eyes were always on more money, more control, more power, and his temper was the tool that cleared the way. In meetings his voice thundered. If someone made a mistake he would slam the table, throw papers, shout so loudly that people's ears rang long after he left. He enjoyed seeing others shrink back, enjoyed the control his anger gave him. He once told a rival, "Fear is better than loyalty, loyalty fades, but fear lasts." And those who heard it believed he meant every word. It became his rule, and the city lived by that rule. Even at grand parties where music played and lights glittered, people laughed too quickly at his jokes. Even when they were not funny, they drank carefully, never too much, because they feared making a mistake in front of him. They dressed carefully too, afraid he might mock them for being cheap or outdated. It was as if the whole room danced on strings he held in his hand, and he pulled those strings whenever he wished, not because he needed to, but because he liked to remind everyone who held the power. But behind all of this glamour and fear, there was also loneliness, though few saw it. The billionaire had no true friends, only people who wanted his money or feared his anger. He had no one who dared to tell him the truth, no one who could look him in the eye without shaking. He lived in a world of yes men, where every voice around him echoed his own, but instead of making him happy, it only fed his temper, because deep down he knew people did not truly respect him. They only feared him, and fear, while powerful, is also fragile. This was the world the billionaire built, a world of silence, of whispers, of trembling hands. A world where no one dared stand against him, because to stand against him meant ruin. People believed he was too big to fight, too powerful to resist, and so they lowered their heads, hoping to pass unnoticed. hoping his temper would not fall upon them. And for years that was how life continued, until one ordinary day, in one ordinary place, a waitress who had nothing to lose decided she had enough, and the shadow that once seemed unbreakable would soon be challenged. The waitress lived a very different life from the billionaire. Her world was small, simple, and full of everyday struggles. She woke up before the sun, tied her hair back quickly, and put on the same uniform she had worn for years. A plain dress with a name tag that carried no power, only her tired smile. She worked in a small diner that smelled of coffee, fried eggs, and toast, the kind of place where truck drivers stopped. For breakfast, office workers grabbed lunch in a hurry, and families came on weekends when they couldn't afford fancy restaurants. For her, the diner was not just a job, it was survival. Her days were long. She worked double shifts sometimes, standing on her feet for hours until her legs ached, carrying heavy trays with practiced balance, cleaning tables with a rag that never seemed to stay clean, and smiling at customers even when she felt exhausted inside. The pay was low, barely enough to cover rent, groceries, and the school supplies her younger brother needed, because she was not just working for herself, she was also taking care of her family. Her father had passed away years ago, and her mother was too sick to work, so the waitress became the pillar of the household, the one who carried the weight quietly on her shoulders. Despite all the hardship, she was not bitter. She had learned to find small joys in little things, like the regular customer who always left her a kind word along with a tip, or the children who drew pictures on napkins and handed them to her proudly. She laughed with her coworkers, most of them also struggling, and they shared inside jokes to make the long hours easier. She loved the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner, and the feeling that she was part of something steady even if it was small. But inside her, there was also a quiet strength, the kind that comes from carrying burdens every day. She had learned to stay calm when customers shouted, to stay patient when the kitchen was slow, to stay polite even when people looked down on her for being just a waitress. She had been through so many difficulties already that fear had no strong hold on her. She did not have money, she did not have luxury, but she had resilience, and resilience is a kind of wealth too, though most people don't see it. At night when she walked home, she thought about the life she wished she had. She sometimes dreamed of finishing school, maybe opening a small bakery of her own. She loved the idea of baking bread and cakes, filling a shop with warmth and kindness, but dreams like that felt far away, hidden behind bills and responsibilities. Still she kept them alive in her heart, because hope was the only thing that made the hard days bearable. She also had a sharp sense of fairness. She couldn't stand when she saw people being rude to others. She hated it when customers yelled at the young busboy who was still learning, or when someone spoke to the cook as if he were less than human. She always defended them in small ways, sometimes with a smile that broke the tension, sometimes with a firm word that reminded people to show respect. Her courage wasn't loud. It wasn't about making speeches or showing off. It was quiet courage, the kind that comes out only when it is needed most. Everyone in the diner knew her as reliable, the one who never gave up, the one who came to work even in the rain, even when she was sick, even when life outside the diner felt like it was falling apart. She kept showing up, because people depended on her. Her mother depended on her medicine. Her brother depended on her for school fees. Her co-workers depended on her to carry part of the heavy load. She had no luxury of giving up, so she didn't. And because she had lived this way for so long, she had learned something powerful without even realizing it. She had learned not to be afraid of people just because they had money or titles. She had seen enough to know that kindness mattered more than wealth, and hard work built more strength than anger ever could. So when others trembled at the thought of powerful men, she did not. She respected people who respected her, but she never bowed to cruelty, even if she stayed polite on the outside. In her heart she was unshakable. It was this unshakable heart that set her apart. Though nobody noticed yet, day after day she served coffee, wiped counters, laughed at silly jokes from regulars, and went home tired but still standing. People around her thought she was just an ordinary waitress, nothing more. But inside her was a quiet fire, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right test, and that test was about to come. Because life has a way of bringing opposites together. The billionaire who was feared by all and the waitress who seemed powerless were about to meet. The man whose shadow stretched across the city would step into the diner where her world existed, and for the first time his temper would meet someone who did not tremble, someone who had faced harder battles in her own way, Someone who knew what it meant to stand tall without money, without power, but with dignity, and that dignity was something his billions could never buy. She didn't know it yet, but the day was coming when she would be tested. The day when her patience, her courage, and her sense of fairness would all come together, and the quiet strength she carried for years would finally show its true power, not just to the billionaire, but to everyone watching. It was a quiet morning at the diner. The kind of morning when sunlight spilled through the windows and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The waitress moved quickly between the tables, balancing plates of eggs, toast, and bacon, smiling at the regulars who came almost every day. Everything felt ordinary, until the glass door opened and the room changed. The billionaire walked in, and with him came a wave of silence that spread across the diner like a shadow. People noticed immediately. Even those who had never seen him in person knew who he was. They had seen his face on newspapers, on television, in the headlines that praised his wealth or whispered about his temper. He didn't need to announce himself. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, and the bodyguards who entered behind him spoke louder than words. The regular chatter of forks against plates softened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the hum of the jukebox in the corner seemed too loud in his presence. The manager of the diner rushed forward nervously, wiping his hands on his apron. He greeted the billionaire with an eager smile that looked more like fear. He offered the best table near the window, the one usually reserved for families. The billionaire sat down without saying thank you, his expression cold. His eyes scanning the room as if everything and everyone around him was beneath him. His bodyguards stood near the entrance, their arms folded, watching as if trouble could appear from the smallest gesture. The staff whispered in the kitchen. Some peeked out nervously. Others told each other to be careful, to not make mistakes, because they had all heard the stories of how he shouted at people in public, how he destroyed businesses with a single word, how even the powerful bowed to his temper. And now he was here, in their small diner, ordering coffee like any other man. But unlike any other man, he carried an aura that made everyone shrink back. The waitress was told by the manager to take his order. Her co-workers warned her quietly, "Be careful, don't upset him, do everything perfectly." She listened but did not let the fear sink into her bones. She picked up her notepad and pen, straightened her uniform, and walked to his table with the same calm steps she used with every other customer. She greeted him politely, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his without trembling. He barely glanced at her, as if she were invisible, and muttered, "His order, black coffee, very hot, nothing else." As she walked back to the counter, she could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her, waiting to see if she would falter, waiting to see if she would make the mistake that would spark his anger. She poured the coffee carefully, steam rising from the cup, and placed it on a tray. Her hands steady though the room around her buzzed with silent tension. When she placed the cup in front of him, he gave her a look sharp enough to cut, as though daring her to disappoint him. Minutes passed, the billionaire lifted the cup to his lips, and the silence stretched. Everyone seemed to watch without looking directly, waiting for his reaction. He sipped once, twice, then frowned. The diner's air seemed to tighten. His eyes narrowed, and the room held its breath. The waitress stood nearby, ready to refill if needed, her face calm, her hands folded in front of her apron. He placed the cup down with a sharp thud, louder than it needed to be. His voice followed, low but harsh. "This coffee is not hot enough." The words cut through the diner like a blade. The manager flinched. The cook in the kitchen froze. A fork slipped from a customer's hand. No one dared to speak. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening, his presence heavy like a storm about to break, the kind of storm everyone feared. The waitress looked at him, her mind working quickly. She knew this was the moment people talked about, the moment his temper could explode, the moment when silence or submission was the only safe choice. And yet, deep inside her, something steady held her in place. She didn't rush to apologize. She didn't tremble or lower her eyes. She simply stood, her heart beating strong, as if the years of carrying burdens had prepared her for this exact test. The billionaire drummed his fingers on the table impatiently, waiting for her to crumble, waiting for her to stumble into excuses. But she did not. She nodded once and said in a calm tone, "I'll bring you another cup, sir," then turned back toward the counter, her steps measured, her shoulders straight, her dignity intact. She poured a fresh cup, hotter this time. the steam curling high above the rim, and returned it to his table, placing it gently before him. He took the new cup, tasted it again, and gave a grunt that might have been approval or might have been nothing at all. The tension in the room loosened slightly, but not completely. Everyone still watched with nervous eyes, wondering what would happen next, wondering if this was the end of the storm or just the beginning. The waitress, however, did not let the unease break her. She had faced harder days, harder battles, and though she knew who sat before her was a man feared by many, she also knew he was just a man drinking coffee like everyone else. This first encounter did not end in shouting, not yet, but it planted the seed of something greater. The waitress's calmness, her steady eyes, her refusal to shrink back. It was something the billionaire was not used to. Most people trembled. Most people begged to please him. But she had met his gaze without fear, and though he might not admit it, though he might never say it out loud, he noticed, deep inside, he noticed, and that simple act was the beginning of everything that would follow. The customers returned to their meals, the kitchen resumed its work, the manager sighed in relief. But the story of that morning was already being written in whispers. They would say later that the waitress did not bow to him, that she served him like any other customer, that she kept her calm while others trembled, and though it seemed like nothing at the time, it was the spark before the fire, the moment before the storm, the first step toward a clash that would shake more than just the walls of a small diner. It would shake the very shadow the billionaire had built around the city. The diner had never been so tense. Every customer seemed to eat in silence. Every worker moved carefully as if one wrong sound could break the fragile calm. The billionaire sat at his table, sipping slowly, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. He was the kind of man who did not just drink coffee. He tested people with every glance, every gesture, waiting for them to fail, waiting for a reason to let his anger spill, and soon that reason arrived. It began with something small, as it always did. His spoon clinked against the saucer too loudly, or the coffee cooled quicker than he liked. Maybe the napkin was not folded as perfectly as it should have been. For ordinary people these things were nothing. But for him they were excuses, excuses to remind others of his power. He tapped the spoon against the cup again, sharp, impatient, and then he called out, his voice deep and sharp, "Waitress!" The sound cut through the diner like a whip. The chatter stopped again. Forks froze halfway to mouths, and all eyes flicked toward the waitress. She walked forward calmly, her pen still tucked behind her ear, her notepad in hand though she knew she did not need it. She stopped at his table and asked softly, "Yes, sir." Her tone polite but steady, no trace of fear, and that steadiness seemed to irritate him more than any mistake. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling in a sneer. "This is unacceptable," he said, pointing at the cup. "I told you I wanted it hot, boiling hot, not lukewarm like this." His words carried enough volume to make sure the whole diner heard. The manager flinched from behind the counter, already rushing forward with nervous steps. But the billionaire raised his hand, stopping him, his eyes locked only on the waitress. "Do you people not understand simple instructions?" A hush fell again, the kind of hush filled with fear. The cook peeked from the kitchen door, his face pale. The busboy froze mid-step holding dirty plates. Even the customers, people who had nothing to do with this, sat quietly, pretending not to stare but unable to look away. This was the moment they had all heard about, the moment when his temper exploded, and now they were watching it unfold in front of them. The billionaire slammed the spoon on the table, the sound making the salt shaker tremble. "I could buy this whole place with the money in my pocket," he said loudly. "And yet you can't even bring me a proper cup of coffee. What kind of worthless service is this?" His words burned, not just at the waitress but at everyone who worked there. Words meant to humiliate, words meant to crush spirits. He enjoyed the control, enjoyed the way the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. The manager finally stepped forward, bowing his head, his voice shaky. "I'm very sorry, sir. We'll replace it right away. No charge, of course." But the billionaire snapped his fingers, not even looking at him. "I wasn't talking to you," he said coldly. "I was talking to her. Let her explain why she can't do something so simple." The waitress stood still, her heart steady. She had been shouted at before, by rude customers, by people who thought waitresses were invisible. But this was different. This was louder, harsher, and in front of so many watching eyes. The billionaire leaned forward, his face closer now, his words like fire. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. The The question heavy, dangerous, one he had used many times before to scare people into silence. Do you know what happens when people waste my time? They lose everything, jobs, homes, reputations, everything. He slammed his palm flat on the table, making the silverware jump. And you think you can serve me this? The waitress took in the sight, the man dressed in his perfect suit, the gold watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her yearly wages, the cold fire in his eyes that had destroyed so many lives. She knew every other worker in the diner wanted her to apologize quickly, to bow her head, to beg for forgiveness and avoid disaster. She knew the manager was silently praying she would not make it worse, but inside her something refused to bend. Something quiet but unshakable held her back. From fear. The customers whispered to each other. One mother pulled her child closer, afraid that even a child's laugh might anger the man more. The busboy set the plates down gently, afraid of making a sound. The cook muttered under his breath, "Poor girl." But none of them moved to help, because that was how fear worked. It froze people. It made them watch but not act, and the billionaire thrived on it. He looked around, satisfied that everyone had witnessed his display of power, satisfied that once again he had made the room his. But he miscalculated one thing. He thought the waitress would shrink, that she would tremble like the others, but her silence was not fear. It was strength gathering. It was patience waiting for the right moment to speak, and that moment was close, closer than anyone in the room could have guessed. He thought his anger would crush her, but instead, it was about to reveal something he had never faced before, someone who would not be broken, someone who would not bow. For now, though, the storm raged, his voice rising, echoing against the walls. "This is pathetic, utterly pathetic. I should shut this place down tomorrow. I should make sure none of you ever work again." His threats poured out like thunder, and the diner seemed to shrink under the weight of his fury. But in the middle of that storm stood the waitress, her hands still, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on his without flinching, and though he could not see it yet, though no one could see it, yet the storm was about to change direction. Because temper has power only when fear feeds it, and in that moment, as his anger spilled louder and louder, one person in the room was no longer feeding his power. One person refused to bow, and that refusal would soon grow into something far greater than anger. It would grow into courage, and courage has a way of changing everything. The diner was silent. The billionaire's voice had filled every corner, his anger heavy like a storm cloud pressing down on everyone inside. The manager's hands shook. The cook kept peeking nervously from the kitchen door. The busboy stood frozen with wide eyes. Even the customers sat stiff, unsure whether to leave or stay. It was the kind of silence where no one dared to breathe too loudly, because the man at the center of it all was known for destroying anyone who crossed him, and now his rage had found a target. The waitress stood in front of him, her apron slightly wrinkled, her hair tied back, her hands still at her sides. She looked like the simplest person in the room, but in that moment she carried more weight than anyone else. She listened to his threats, his insults. His loud words meant to break her spirit, and instead of shrinking, she lifted her head, her eyes steady, her face calm, the kind of calm that comes not from ignorance but from strength. The kind of calm that made everyone watching hold their breath. He expected her to apologize, to stutter and tremble, to say, "I'm sorry, sir," and bow like so many before her had done. He waited for it. He almost smirked in advance, certain he would win, but when she finally spoke, her voice was different than anyone expected. It was soft but clear, strong without shouting. "Sir," she said, "I brought you coffee like I bring to every customer. I treat you no differently than I treat anyone else, and I will not let you speak to me as if I am less than human." The words floated in the air, simple but powerful. They were like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading through the silence. The customers blinked, shocked, the manager gasped, his lips forming the word no silently. The cook whispered to himself in disbelief. The busboy nearly dropped the glass in his hand. No one could believe what they had just heard, because no one ever spoke to the billionaire like that. No one ever dared. The billionaire's face darkened. His mouth opened slightly as if he had misheard, as if he needed her to repeat it. But she did not repeat. She only stood taller, her shoulders straight, her eyes still locked on his. There was no mockery in her tone, no sarcasm, no disrespect, just a simple truth spoken with dignity. and that dignity carried more force than any raised voice ever could. His hand tightened into a fist on the table, his watch glinting in the light. He leaned forward, his voice low, dangerous. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" he asked again, slower this time, every syllable dripping with warning. But she did not blink, she did not flinch, she simply answered, "I know exactly who I'm speaking to. But you are a customer here, nothing more, and I am a waitress, not your servant, not your punching bag, and not someone who will let you humiliate me." The room seemed to tremble with her words. A customer coughed nervously. Another pressed her child closer to her side. The manager nearly fainted. He wanted to step in, to beg her to stop, but something held him back. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the faint spark of admiration that he himself didn't understand. The billionaire, on the other hand, was not used to this. He was used to fear, to people bowing their heads and begging, and now here was a woman who earned less in a week than he spent on lunch, looking at him without fear, telling him no. His temper rose like fire, his chest tightening, his eyes narrowing. But beneath the anger was something else. Something he would never admit: surprise. For the first time in years he was met with resistance. Not from rivals in boardrooms, not from politicians who wanted his donations, but from a waitress in a small diner. Someone who had nothing to lose, someone who could not be bought, someone whose strength came not from money but from dignity. And dignity was something his billions could never control. The waitress continued, her voice steady though her co-workers behind her trembled. "You may scare others, you may make people bow because of your money, but not me. I work hard every day, I take care of my family, and I don't need to be rich to know my worth, so you can shout, you can threaten, but I will not let you treat me as less than a person." The words hit him harder than anyone expected, harder than his own anger hit others. The customers looked at each other, whispers spreading, small at first but growing. The busboy's eyes filled with something like hope. The cook leaned against the kitchen doorframe with a half-smile he quickly hid. Even the manager, though terrified of losing his job, felt his chest tighten with a strange pride, because what they were witnessing was more than just defiance. It was courage, raw and real, standing against the very man who fed on fear. For a long moment the billionaire said nothing, his face red, his jaw tight. He tapped his finger against the table, each tap louder than the last. His anger boiled inside, ready to explode, but at the same time, the silence in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged only to him. It belonged also to her, to the waitress who stood tall in her simple uniform, and for the first time in years, his power in a room was not absolute. He tried to laugh, a cold, sharp laugh. "You think you're brave, standing there with your cheap uniform and your little job?" he said. "I could ruin you with one phone call. I could make sure you never work anywhere again." But even as he said it, his words carried less weight than before, because she was not trembling, she was not begging, she simply answered, "Then do what you must, sir. But I will not bow, not today, not ever." And that was the moment when the air itself seemed to change. The customers straightened in their seats. The busboy let out the breath he didn't know he was holding. The cook grinned openly now, and even the billionaire's bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, because they too could feel it. The balance had shifted. The spell of fear that followed their master everywhere had cracked. And it was cracked not by power, not by wealth, but by the steady courage of a woman who had nothing but her voice. What she said that day would echo far beyond the diner, but for now, it lived in the stunned silence. The heavy pause after truth has been spoken. The billionaire stared at her, furious, confused, and deep down unsettled, because he realized something he had never felt before. His temper had met its match, and no amount of shouting could shake the waitress who stood before him like a wall he could not break. The diner was frozen in time. It felt as if the clocks had stopped ticking. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above and the shallow breaths of people afraid to inhale too deeply. The billionaire sat at his table, his face red with anger, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming loudly against the wood. He had shouted, he had threatened, he had warned her of ruin, and yet the waitress had stood her ground, calm, steady, and unbroken. The storm he carried with him everywhere had finally hit something it could not destroy, and the silence that followed was heavier than the anger itself. Everyone in the diner was caught in that silence. The manager stood near the counter with his apron twisted in his hands, sweat forming on his forehead. He wanted to speak. He wanted to beg her to stop before things went too far, but the words stuck in his throat. He was too afraid to make it worse. The cook leaned against the kitchen doorway, his spatula still in hand, his mouth slightly open, unsure whether to laugh or hide. The busboy clutched a tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. His young eyes filled with shock and awe. The customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down at their plates, others daring to glance at the waitress as if to say, "How did you do that?" The billionaire's bodyguards stood near the door, their eyes darting between their boss and the waitress. Even they looked uneasy. They were used to seeing him crush people with his words. They were used to seeing the world bend at his command. But this was different, this was new, and though they stayed still, their posture betrayed the tension in their muscles. They were ready for the explosion that seemed certain to come. The waitress stood quietly, not rushing to fill the silence, not apologizing to soften his fury. Her hands rested gently against her apron, her breathing steady, her face calm, but inside she felt her heart beating hard. She knew she had crossed a line no one dared to cross. She knew this man had the power to destroy people's lives with a single call, but she also knew something else, something more important. She knew she was right, and that truth gave her strength. It made her spine straight. It made her eyes unflinching. It gave her a kind of courage that no amount of money could buy. The billionaire leaned forward slowly, his voice low now, dangerous in its quietness. "Do you really think you can speak to me like that and walk away?" he asked, his words heavy, every syllable meant to crush her. But she did not look away. She did not tremble. She answered simply, "Yes, I can, because you are a man, and I am a woman doing her job, and nothing gives you the right to humiliate me." Her words were not loud, yet they carried across the diner like thunder. Everyone heard them, everyone felt them, and the silence deepened, thicker, heavier. The billionaire's eyes narrowed. He was a man who thrived on control, who fed on fear, and yet in that moment he felt the grip of control slip. He wanted to explode, to shout louder, to slam the table harder, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the waitress's eyes held his without blinking. Perhaps it was the stillness of the room where every single person watched, not with fear anymore, but with something else, something close to hope. He could feel the shift, though he would never admit it. The room was no longer entirely his. The customers began to exchange glances. A man in a suit leaned slightly toward his wife and whispered, "She's not afraid." A young mother smiled faintly, though she quickly hid it. Even the cook chuckled under his breath before coughing to cover it. The silence had started to change. It was no longer only silence of fear. It was the silence before something new. The silence where people realized they were seeing something extraordinary, something they never thought possible. The billionaire clenched his jaw, his voice finally rising again, though not as strong as before. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll make sure of it. People will know not to hire you, you'll lose everything." But his words did not sting as they usually did, because the waitress replied with calm certainty, "I have very little already, sir, but at least what I have is mine, my dignity is mine, my hard work is mine, and you cannot take that away from me." Her voice rang clear, and the silence broke for the first time, not with noise, but with something else, the faintest murmur of approval from someone at the back of the diner. It was small, almost nothing, but the billionaire heard it. He turned his head sharply, his glare scanning the room, and the customers quickly looked back at their plates. But the seed had been planted. The silence was no longer his weapon. It was hers. The weight of her courage filled it, and it pressed against him in a way no one ever had before. He was used to silence meaning obedience, submission, defeat, but this silence was different. This silence carried resistance. It carried quiet power, and he hated it. The manager finally stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Please, let's calm down. There's no need for this." But his words fell flat, because the true battle was already happening, not between loud voices or angry fists, but between dignity and dominance, between calm truth and fiery temper. The billionaire had shouted, but it was the waitress's calm replies that echoed in everyone's minds, and that shift terrified him more than he wanted to admit. For the next few minutes, the diner felt like it was holding its breath. The billionaire sat back in his chair, his coffee untouched, his glare sharp enough to pierce glass. The waitress stood firm, her calmness like an anchor in the storm. The customers ate slowly, nervously, waiting to see if the man would unleash his full wrath or if he would leave in anger. The bodyguards exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they should step in, and in that thick silence the waitress's courage grew even stronger because she realized something important. She realized that his anger was big, but it was not bigger than her dignity, and once a person understands that, fear loses its chains. This was the silence before the storm, the silence that stretched too long, too heavy, the silence where everyone braced for the next explosion. But beneath it all, something had already shifted. The billionaire had shouted and threatened, but the waitress had stood, and now the power in the room was no longer entirely his. The storm could still come, it could still rage, but deep down everyone knew the air had changed forever, and nothing would ever be the same again. News travels fast in the modern world, faster than cars on highways, faster than trains racing across the land, faster even than whispers in a small town, and what had happened in the little diner that day was too powerful to remain hidden. At first it was just a few customers who carried the story. They told their families at dinner, they told their co-workers during lunch breaks, and soon the tale of the waitress who stood up to the feared billionaire began to spread like fire in dry grass. One person told another, another told a group, and then someone wrote about it online. The story that began in silence now had wings. A teenager who had been at the diner that morning shared what he saw on social media. His post was simple, just a few lines. "A billionaire came to our local diner today," he shouted at a waitress, but she stood up to him and didn't back down. "I've never seen anything like it." That post was shared again and again. Strangers commented with shock, with admiration, with disbelief. Soon photos taken secretly by customers began to appear, blurry but real, showing the billionaire's angry face, showing the waitress standing tall, and those pictures spoke louder than words. Within hours thousands of people had seen them, within a day millions had. The nation reacted as if a long-hidden truth had been uncovered. People who had once feared the billionaire now spoke openly. Finally someone had the courage, they said. Finally someone stood up to him. Talk shows picked it up. Radio hosts discussed it. Journalists wrote articles with headlines like, "Waitress challenges billionaire everyone feared," and "Small diner, big courage." The billionaire's name, once spoken in whispers, now filled screens and papers. But this time not with power and success, this time with humiliation and outrage. For years people had accepted his temper. They had accepted his control because no one dared to resist. But seeing an ordinary waitress do what powerful men and women had failed to do inspired something deep. People felt braver. People felt that maybe money did not have to rule everything. Maybe dignity could stand against wealth. Maybe courage could silence fear. In coffee shops, in schools, in offices, people began to talk about the waitress not as just a worker in a small diner, but as a symbol of what was possible when one person refused to bow. Of course, not everyone praised her. Some called her reckless. Some said she had put her job, her co-workers, even her whole town in danger. They said, "You don't provoke men like him. You don't poke a lion with a stick. Better to stay quiet. Better to keep your head down." But even those who criticized her could not deny the truth. The world had noticed, and the billionaire was no longer untouchable. His anger had been met with calm resistance, and people wanted to see more. The billionaire himself tried to fight back. He released statements through his lawyers claiming the story was exaggerated. He insisted he was the victim of lies. He tried to use his usual tactics of intimidation. But this time it did not work the same, because this time the world was watching. Every move he made was analyzed. Every word he spoke was debated. He could not silence millions of voices the way he silenced one journalist or one business owner. The more he tried to deny, the more people remembered the images of his red face and the steady eyes of the waitress who defied him. The waitress, meanwhile, became an unexpected hero. People came to the diner not just for coffee or food, but to see her, to meet the woman who had done what no one else dared. They shook her hand, they thanked her. They left tips bigger than the cost of their meals. Reporters asked for interviews. Her co-workers looked at her with new respect. The manager, though still worried, could not hide his pride. The busboy followed her around like she was a star. And even the cook bragged to customers. "I was there that day. I saw it with my own eyes." She did not seek the attention. She did not ask for fame. She only wanted to do her job with dignity. But the world had chosen her to be a symbol. And though it felt strange, she accepted it quietly, because deep down she knew she had only done what was right. And doing what is right, even in the face of fear, should never be something to regret. Television panels debated what it meant. Some said it showed the power of ordinary people. Others said it showed the limits of money. Some said it was just one small act blown out of proportion. But even as experts argued, ordinary people felt something simple and strong. They felt hope. Hope that the rich and powerful could be held accountable. Hope that arrogance could be challenged. Hope that courage still mattered in a world too often ruled by fear. The billionaire hated it. His empire was not built to face ridicule. He was used to control. But now the nation's laughter was louder than his anger. Memes spread online mocking his temper. Comedians joked about him on stage. His name no longer made people silent. It made them shake their heads or laugh. And in his world, that was worse than fear, because fear he could control, laughter he could not. And so the storm that began in one small diner grew into something far bigger. Bigger than the town. Bigger than the billionaire. It became a story for the whole nation. A reminder that power is not only about money. That sometimes the smallest voice can echo the loudest, and that dignity, once shown, can inspire millions. The waitress never planned it. She never sought it. But her act of courage had changed more than her life. It had shaken the shadow of a man who thought he was untouchable. And it had lit a fire in people who had been silent for too long. The nation reacted not just with words, but with hearts. People carried her story into their own struggles, into their own fears. They remembered that if a waitress could stand against a billionaire, then maybe they too could stand against whatever giants they faced in their lives. And that was the true power of her defiance. Not that she embarrassed a rich man, but that she reminded a nation of the strength inside ordinary people. The world after the diner incident was not the same. The billionaire who once walked into rooms with his head high and his temper like a weapon now found that people no longer looked at him with the same fear. Some still bowed, some still pretended to respect him. But the eyes of the nation had seen what happened. They had seen a waitress stand against him without trembling. And once fear is broken in public, it cannot be put back together. His shadow, once heavy and unshakable, had cracks running through it. Cracks that grew wider every day. For the billionaire, it was a new kind of pain. Not physical, not financial, but something deeper. His pride was wounded, his reputation damaged. The power he carried in his temper no longer worked as it once did. Before, a single glare from him could silence a room. But now people remembered the waitress who did not bow. And in their minds they compared themselves to her. They asked, if she can do it, why can't I? And that thought, simple but dangerous, weakened him more than any business loss ever could. He tried to continue as before, walking into offices, making demands, but the reaction was different now. Some people hesitated before rushing to obey. Others spoke more boldly than they once dared. He could feel the shift like sand slipping under his feet. His empire still stood, his wealth still massive, but the control he loved most, the control of fear, was slipping, and though he raged in private, he could not change the truth. The waitress had shown the world that his temper was not invincible. For the waitress, life also changed, but in a way she had never imagined. She became known far beyond her small diner. Strangers recognized her face. Reporters asked for her time. People called her a hero, a fighter, a symbol. She listened politely, but inside she remained the same. She still tied her hair back in the morning, still wore her uniform, still poured coffee and cleaned tables, because that was her life, and she was proud of it. She had not spoken up to become famous. She had spoken up because she refused to be treated as less than human, and that truth kept her grounded. Yet even in her simple life, opportunities began to appear. She received offers for better jobs. People wanted her to speak at events. Some even suggested she write a book. She was overwhelmed, unsure if she was ready for such things. But she also felt something stronger than doubt. She felt the support of ordinary people everywhere. Letters arrived at the diner, some from mothers, some from workers, some from students, all thanking her for reminding them of their own worth. "You gave me courage," one letter said. "You reminded me I don't have to stay silent." Another wrote, "Those words touched her more than any fame could." Her co-workers looked at her differently too. The busboy, once shy and nervous, now walked taller when he carried trays. The cook spoke more firmly to rude customers. Even the manager, though still cautious, began to believe the diner was stronger than he thought. Her courage had spread like warmth through the small walls of that place, and from there it spread outward to the city, to the country, to the world beyond. The billionaire watched this quietly, bitterly. His empire still made him rich, but it no longer made him untouchable. When people laughed at his temper, when they mocked his arrogance, he felt a sting he could not heal with money. He could silence individuals with lawsuits or threats, but he could not silence millions who had seen the truth. He could not erase the memory of a woman who stood tall with nothing but her voice, and that reality followed him everywhere. For the nation, her story became a reminder. A tale told in classrooms, in workplaces, in homes, that courage does not always come from the powerful. Sometimes it comes from the most ordinary places, from someone who serves coffee, from someone who cleans, from someone whose name was not known until the day they chose to stand. And that truth gave people a new kind of strength. They began to see dignity not as something given by wealth, but as something every human being carried within them. The waitress herself remained humble. When asked how she found the courage, she simply said, "I was tired of being treated like I was nothing, and I knew if I didn't speak, I would lose a part of myself." Those words resonated deeply, because they were not grand speeches or complicated ideas. They were simple and real, spoken by someone who lived the struggles so many understood. She did not claim to be a hero. She only claimed her right to be treated with respect, and that was why people believed in her. In the end, the story was not just about her or about him. It was about the battle between fear and dignity. A battle fought not in palaces or courts, but in a small diner on an ordinary morning. And in that battle, the billionaire's temper lost to the quiet strength of a woman who refused to bow. He had money, he had power, he had influence, but none of it could break her calm truth, and that truth became a new kind of power, one that spread far beyond the walls of the diner. She went home each night still tired from work, still carrying the weight of her family's needs, but she carried something else now too, the knowledge that one act of courage can light a fire, that standing tall even once can echo across a nation. She had not planned it, she had not sought it, but she had lived it, and because of that, the world had changed a little. The billionaire's shadow no longer felt endless because people had seen it break, and once you see something break, you know it is not unbreakable. And so the story closed not with anger, not with fear, but with hope, hope that no matter how powerful someone seems, no matter how feared their temper, there is always a chance that one steady voice, one ordinary person, can stand up and remind the world of what truly matters: dignity, respect, and the courage to say enough is enough.